I still remember the first time I met him. His name was Derek, and he was exactly what I never wanted for my daughter Julia. Handsome, charming, and with a smile that could disarm even the most suspicious of hearts. But I knew better than to trust that smile. He came into our lives like a calm breeze, but I could already feel the storm brewing beneath the surface. It all started when Julia came home one evening, her eyes sparkling with a mixture of excitement and something I couldn't quite place. "Mom, I want you to meet someone special," she said, almost as if she was trying to convince herself as much as me. I had no idea who this someone was, but from the tone of her voice, I could tell that it was someone serious. I remember sitting in my chair by the fireplace, the flickering flames casting shadows on the old oak panelling. My life had been built on hard work, patience, and a firm belief that people had to earn their place. Nothing in this world came easy, not even wealth. My late husband, Thomas, had worked his fingers to the bone, creating a fortune that took decades to build. He had left it all to me when he passed away, knowing I would keep it safe, protect it, and ensure that it went to the right people. But Julia, my daughter, she was so different from me. She had grown up with privilege, without knowing the sacrifices behind the luxuries. I had always wanted to protect her from the harshness of life, but as she grew older, I realized that I couldn't protect her from everything, and then came Derek. He walked in with the kind of confidence you only see in men who have nothing to lose. His eyes locked onto mine immediately, and I could tell that he was trying to figure me out. He had a way of speaking that made you feel like you were the most important person in the room, but I wasn't fooled. I had seen men like him before. They wanted something, and they would stop at nothing to get it. "Mrs. Stevens," he said, extending a hand, his voice smooth like velvet. "It's an honor to meet you." I didn't take his hand. Instead, I studied him carefully. He was tall, well-dressed, with an air of sophistication that seemed almost rehearsed. But it was his eyes that unsettled me the most. There was something behind them, a coldness that didn't quite match the warmth of his smile. "Call me Helen," I replied, my voice steady. "But you should know I don't hand out compliments easily," he chuckled. But I didn't find it amusing. "I don't expect them," he said, sitting down next to Julia. "I've heard a lot about you, Mrs. Stevens, about your success, your life, and the legacy you've built." At that moment I knew. I knew what he wanted. It was the way he spoke, the way he positioned himself in the room, like a man trying to get into your good graces without giving anything away. Julia, oblivious to all of it, watched him with stars in her eyes. She was already entranced. "Mum, Derek and I have been seeing each other for a while now," Julia added, her voice filled with hope. I didn't respond immediately. I needed to think. I needed to decide whether or not this man was going to become a threat to everything I had worked for, to everything my late husband had sacrificed for. The last thing I wanted was for my daughter to get caught up in the wrong relationship. But it wasn't just about her happiness. It was about my legacy. Derek wasn't here because he loved Julia. He was here because he saw an opportunity. "Well," I finally said, breaking the silence. "I'm glad you two are getting along. But remember, Julia, not everyone who smiles at you has good intentions." Julia looked at me, surprised by the weight of my words. She had no idea what I was thinking, but I could see the beginning of doubt in her eyes. Derek, on the other hand, didn't flinch. He simply smiled again. "I understand, Mrs. Stevens. It's important to earn trust, and I intend to do that." I watched him carefully. In that moment, I knew that this wasn't going to end well. But what could I do? I was one person, and Derek was already pulling my daughter into his web. As the weeks passed, I watched Derek weave his way into our lives like a carefully crafted tapestry. Every morning, Julia would call to check in, her voice brighter than I'd ever heard it before. Derek had taken her to fancy restaurants, to expensive spas, and had showered her with gifts. Gifts that looked like they belonged in a magazine spread. Yet with each passing day my suspicions grew. Julia was smitten, completely enchanted by his charm and apparent sophistication. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to Derek than met the eye. Every time I saw him, I found myself scrutinizing his every movement, every word, searching for the cracks in his perfect facade. I could see Julia's glowing face as she talked about him. She spoke of their plans to travel the world, of the life they were building together. She had never been so excited about a relationship before. I wanted to believe her happiness was genuine, but I knew better. Life had taught me that appearances were often deceiving. One afternoon, as I sat alone in the sitting room, a knock came at the door. I had expected it to be a delivery, or maybe one of the servants needing something, but when I opened the door, there stood Derek. He was alone this time. Not the polished figure he had been before, but still carrying the same air of arrogance and confidence. "Mrs. Stevens," he said with that smooth tone of his. "Is Julia here?" I was hoping we could talk for a moment. I raised an eyebrow, hesitant. "Julia's out shopping, but you're welcome to wait." "What's this about?" Derek's eyes flickered for a moment, almost like he hadn't expected me to be so direct. "I wanted to discuss something important with you. It's about the future, Julia's future." I stepped aside, allowing him to enter. The warmth of the fire crackled in the background as I motioned for him to sit. He took a seat across from me, his posture perfect, his expression unreadable. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice low, "about the life I want to build with Julia. And I want to be honest with you. I know that your wealth means a great deal to you. It's clear you've worked hard for everything you have." I leaned forward, my heart rate picking up. This was the moment I had feared. "And?" I said, keeping my voice steady. "I want to make sure Julia and I have a secure future," he continued, not missing a beat. "We've been talking about marriage, but I'm aware that certain practical matters need to be addressed before we take that step." I wasn't sure I had heard him correctly. "Practical matters?" Derek nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. "Your estate, for one. I know it's not something you want to think about, but it's something we'll need to discuss at some point. After all, Julia is your only heir, and—" "Stop right there," I interrupted, my voice suddenly sharp. "You're not talking about what I think you are." Derek didn't flinch. "I am. I want to ensure that when the time comes, everything is in order for Julia. I want her to have everything she deserves." I stared at him, my mind racing. The audacity, the boldness of his approach. He had planned this. From the moment he walked into our lives, it had been clear. This wasn't just about love. This was about something much bigger. "You think my daughter is going to hand over her inheritance to you?" I asked, my voice dripping with skepticism. Derek's smile never wavered. "I don't want her to do anything without your approval, of course. But the reality is your estate is vast, and it's only fair that Julia's future be secured. I'm not asking for anything unreasonable. We just want to make sure everything is in place." I could feel the blood rush to my head. I was seeing through him now. It wasn't about love or a future with Julia. It was about the money, the power, the control over what I had built. Derek wasn't interested in Julia for who she was. He was interested in what she could bring to the table. "I think it's time you leave," I said, my voice cold, my patience wearing thin. "You're not welcome here." He stood up, as if he had expected my reaction, and nodded slowly. "I understand. But remember, Mrs. Stevens, you can't protect Julia forever. One day she'll have to make her own choices." I didn't answer him. I simply watched as he turned and walked out the door, leaving me with a sinking feeling in my chest. I had seen enough. I knew what he wanted, and it wasn't Julia's happiness, it was my fortune. The days following Derek's visit were a blur. I went about my usual routine, managing the estate, overseeing the investments, keeping an eye on everything, that is, except for what was happening right under my nose. Julia was still infatuated with Derek, and no matter how many times I tried to raise my concerns, she brushed them aside as if I was being overly protective, old-fashioned even. I couldn't convince her. Not yet. I spent a lot of time thinking about Derek's visit. The more I reflected on it, the more his words haunted me. The way he'd spoken, so calmly, so confidently, like he had already won. There was a certain finality to his demeanour, as if he already knew that the estate would eventually be his, even if it wasn't today. But what he didn't know, what he didn't realise, was that I wasn't going to let that happen. Not without a fight, and so I watched. I watched Derek carefully. I had to. There was no other choice. I needed to understand how far he was willing to go, how far he had already gone. Over the next few weeks, Derek's presence in our lives grew. He was always around, always making sure he was seen, always reinforcing the image of the perfect partner for Julia. It was no longer just about romance. It was a performance, an act. He was playing the role of the devoted lover, the supportive boyfriend, the man who wanted nothing more than to marry my daughter. But behind that mask I could see something else, a man with ambition. A man who wanted to be more than just her husband. He wanted to be the one in control. Julia, meanwhile, was becoming more and more entangled in Derek's web. She would talk about him constantly, recounting every moment they spent together, every little thing he did to make her feel special. I couldn't deny that Derek knew how to keep her happy on the surface. He took her on trips, bought her expensive jewellery, and even promised her a life of luxury. But what concerned me more than anything was how he was manipulating her. The way he planted seeds of doubt in her mind, undermining her trust in me, in her family. "Mum, Derek thinks you're too focused on money," she said one evening, her voice tinged with frustration. "He says you worry too much about the future and that you need to live in the present. Life's short, he says. Don't you want me to be happy?" I almost laughed. Of course I want you to be happy, but happiness isn't just about trips and presents. It's about stability, security. It's about building a life that isn't dependent on someone else's manipulation. Julia didn't respond. Instead, she went silent, a hurt look in her eyes. She had begun to see me as the villain, the one standing in the way of her happiness. I could see it in her eyes, in the way she pulled away whenever I tried to offer advice. Derek was winning. He was slowly isolating her from me. But what Julia didn't know was that Derek had a history I had been digging into, quietly, carefully. His background wasn't as pristine as he liked to pretend. Derek had moved around a lot in his youth, never staying in one place for long. And his family, well, they were far from the respectable people he liked to present himself as. I'd hired a private investigator. It wasn't something I did lightly, but I knew that in this situation there was no room for mistakes. The investigator came back with disturbing information. Derek had been involved in several questionable business ventures, none of which had gone well. He had a reputation for being charming and persuasive, but once people started digging into his past, they realised that he had left behind a trail of broken promises and debts. But the most shocking discovery: Derek had once been engaged to a woman who had mysteriously disappeared, and no one had ever found out what happened to her. The pieces were starting to fit together, and they didn't paint a pretty picture. I kept this information to myself. I wasn't ready to confront Derek yet. I needed to know more. I needed to catch him in the act, to prove to Julia that Derek wasn't who he claimed to be. I couldn't risk just telling her. I needed solid evidence, so I played along. I smiled when Derek was around. I welcomed him into our home, and I watched him closely. I noticed how he always seemed to have an excuse for everything, why he couldn't meet certain people, why he was always too busy with business matters. He was never straightforward, always vague, always deflecting. One evening, Julia invited Derek to dinner at the house. She was practically glowing, and Derek, ever the charmer, turned on the charm for me as well. He greeted me with a warm handshake, then proceeded to talk at length about how important family was to him. It was all an act, and I wasn't buying it. "Tell me," I said casually as I passed him a glass of wine. "What does your family think about all this?" "About you and Julia?" Derek's smile didn't falter. "They're thrilled, of course. They can't wait to meet her. But you know how it is, Mrs. Stevens. They want to make sure everything is perfect before making a move." I nodded slowly, hiding my growing suspicion. His family was eager to meet Julia. How convenient. It all sounded rehearsed. Too rehearsed. I decided to test him. "And what about your past relationships?" I asked, my voice casual but pointed. "I've heard some things about your previous engagements." Derek's face froze for a split second before his charming smile returned. Yes. The past is the past, Mrs. Stevens. We all have our stories, don't we? But what matters is the future, and Julia and I have a future together." It was a carefully crafted answer, and it told me everything I needed to know. He was hiding something. I could feel it in my bones. I watched as Julia beamed at him, completely oblivious to the tension in the room, and that's when I knew. Derek wasn't just after my wealth. He was after something far more dangerous, control over everything I held dear. It's strange how, over time, people can start to reveal themselves, like threads slowly unwinding from the fabric of a carefully constructed lie. Derek's facade was beginning to crack. Little by little, he started slipping up. It was almost like he couldn't help it. The cracks appeared when I least expected it, in subtle moments, and that was when I knew I had him. One evening, Julia and Derek came over for dinner. Julia was excited about their upcoming trip to Paris, her eyes sparkling as she talked about the details, the hotels they'd be staying at, the designer stores they would visit. But as she spoke, I couldn't help but notice the way Derek's gaze wandered to the large paintings on the walls, the antique furniture, the lavish decor that my late husband and I had accumulated over the years. His eyes lingered too long, a slight gleam in them, like he was mentally calculating how much it was worth. It made my skin crawl. I had already done my research. I knew that he wasn't just after my daughter. He was after everything. The wealth, the house, the reputation, the connections. He wanted it all, and he was using Julia as his ticket to a life of luxury. At the dinner table, I decided to test him further. "You know, Derek," I said casually, sipping my wine, "I've been thinking about how quickly everything has moved with you and Julia. I suppose the idea of marriage is on the horizon, isn't it?" Derek didn't miss a beat. "Of course. We're very much in love, and I want nothing more than to give Julia the life she deserves." I smiled thinly. "The life she deserves, I see. And what about the responsibilities that come with that? The things you can't see right now, the things that might seem less glamorous?" He paused just for a moment, as if the question caught him off guard. Then, with that ever-present smile, he answered, "I understand the responsibilities, Mrs. Stevens. Believe me, I'm more than prepared for what's ahead." "Prepared?" I repeated, leaning in slightly. "Well, I've worked hard for everything I have, Derek. The business, the property, the investments. It's not all glamour and luxury. It's about maintaining what's been built. Can you say the same about your own financial standing?" I saw a flicker of discomfort in his eyes, something he couldn't hide. It lasted only a moment before his smile returned, but I had caught him. He wasn't as prepared as he wanted me to think. If anything, he was underprepared, and that fact made me feel a little more in control. But the real blow came a few days later. It was late in the evening when I received an unexpected call from a lawyer I knew, a man named Gregory. I had met him several times during business dealings, and I trusted him implicitly. He sounded concerned on the phone, his voice urgent. "Mrs. Stevens," he said, his tone serious, "I need you to be aware of something. There's a matter involving Derek that you need to address." I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean? What's going on?" Gregory hesitated before speaking. "I've come across some documents that suggest Derek has been involved in some financial transactions with offshore accounts that are not exactly legal. There's more to it than just that, but I thought you should know. This isn't something that will remain quiet for long." I was stunned into silence. I had suspected Derek's motives, but this was more than I could have imagined. The web he was weaving was far more dangerous than I thought. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because, Mrs. Stevens, this could affect Julia. And if Derek has been hiding this from her, well, I think you need to be prepared. I'm sending you the documents. You should take a look." The call ended abruptly, and I sat there for a long while, staring at the receiver in my hand. My mind raced. I didn't know how deep Derek's deception ran, but I was starting to see the shape of it. Julia had no idea what she was getting herself into. That night I stayed up late, going over the documents Gregory had sent. There were wire transfers to foreign accounts, suspicious transactions that didn't make sense, and several people listed who had no clear connection to Derek's supposed business ventures. But one thing stood out above the rest. Derek had been involved with a network of individuals known for laundering money, individuals who had been under investigation for years. I knew that this wasn't something I could ignore. This wasn't just about protecting my wealth anymore. It was about protecting Julia, about keeping her from falling deeper into Derek's trap. I had to confront him. The following day, I called Julia to my office. I could tell she was nervous, like she already knew something was wrong. "Mom, what's going on? Is everything okay?" I sat down across from her, looking her straight in the eye. "No, Julia, everything is not okay. Derek isn't who you think he is. I've done some digging, and I found some disturbing things." Her face fell. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about his past, his finances, his connections. I'm talking about a man who's using you, and I can prove it." She looked at me in disbelief, the colour draining from her face. "You're lying." "I wish I were," I said softly. "But I'm not." "He's been hiding things from you, Julia. Serious things." She shook her head, almost in denial. "No, Derek would never do that. He loves me." "Love isn't enough when it comes to money, Julia," I said, my voice steady but filled with the weight of years of experience. "I didn't want to do this, but I have to protect you. You deserve better than this. Derek is dangerous." The room fell silent, and I could see the doubt begin to form in her eyes. She didn't want to believe me, but I could tell that something had shifted. Maybe she hadn't realized it before, but the seeds of doubt were planted. And now, it was up to her whether she wanted to pull away from Derek or let herself fall deeper into his trap. For the first time in a long while, I saw fear in Julia's eyes, not because of me, but because deep down, she knew something was wrong. Mothers always know when their children start to doubt, and that day, I saw the smallest fracture in her blind trust toward Derek. It wasn't enough yet, but it was a start. Later that evening, after Julia had stormed out of my study, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat alone in the quiet. The house felt colder somehow, heavier. The sound of the clock ticking in the hallway echoed through the silence like a warning. I knew what was coming. Derek wasn't going to back off easily. Men like him never did. They pushed until they got what they wanted, or until someone pushed back harder. The next morning, I decided to pay Derek a visit. Julia had told me he was working out of a small office downtown, something about consulting investments and property management. It all sounded vague, which only made me more suspicious. When I arrived, I expected a proper office, a reception area, maybe a secretary. Instead, I found a run-down space in an old building, the kind of place where the walls reeked of cigarette smoke and failed promises. The gold letters on the frosted glass door read Derek Hunt Consulting, but they were peeling, barely holding on. I knocked once, twice. A muffled voice from inside said, "Come in." The moment I stepped inside, Derek looked up from behind his desk. His surprise was visible for a brief second before he quickly masked it with that familiar, charming smile. "Helen," he said smoothly, standing up. What a surprise. To what do I owe this pleasure? I closed the door behind me. "We need to talk." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Please, sit." I didn't. I stayed standing, my eyes scanning the room. Papers scattered across the desk, a half-empty cup of coffee, and a few folders with names I didn't recognize. It didn't look like a successful business. It looked like a front. "I've spoken to someone," I said flatly. "A lawyer. He told me about your offshore accounts, about your connections." For the first time since I'd met him, Derek's smile faltered. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb with me," I snapped. "I know about the transactions, Derek. I know about the woman you were engaged to, the one who disappeared. You've been lying to Julia. You've been lying to all of us." His expression hardened. "Be careful, Mrs. Stevens. You're making serious accusations." I stepped closer, refusing to show fear. "I've been around long enough to recognize a fraud when I see one. You think you can come into my home, manipulate my daughter, and steal what I've built? You've underestimated the wrong woman." For a moment, we stood there in silence, the tension so thick I could feel it pressing against my chest. Then, Derek leaned back in his chair, his confidence returning like a wave. "You really think you can stop this?" he asked quietly. "Julia loves me. You've already lost her. It's only a matter of time before she realizes that you're the one standing in the way of her happiness. She'll realize," I said calmly. "Sooner or later she'll see you for what you are." Derek smiled again, but this time it was different, colder, sharper. "You've made a powerful enemy, Mrs. Stevens. I'd be careful if I were you." I left without another word, my heart pounding in my chest. I'd seen the real Derek in that moment. The mask had fallen. Beneath the charm, there was something dangerous, something dark. He wasn't just a liar. He was a predator. That night, Julia didn't come home. I tried calling her several times, but she didn't answer. Panic began to claw at me. I told myself she was probably with Derek, that she just needed some time. But when morning came and she still hadn't returned, I knew something was wrong. I called the police, filed a missing persons report, and gave them Derek's address. They promised to look into it, but I couldn't just sit and wait. Not when every second mattered. By noon I received a call, from Julia. "Mom," she said, her voice trembling. "Please don't be angry. Where are you?" I demanded. "I'm fine," she said quickly. I just needed time to think. "Derek and we decided to get away for a while. We're in the cabin by the lake. I just wanted to tell you that I'm safe." The cabin, the same one my husband had built decades ago, tucked away deep in the woods, a place for peace and solitude. I hadn't been there in years. "Julia," I said, my voice tight, "you need to leave that place now. You're not safe with him." "Mom, stop it," she cried. "You don't know him like I do." "He loves me. You're just trying to control me like you always do." The line went dead before I could say another word. That was when I knew. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about control. Derek had isolated her completely, and I was running out of time. That night I packed a bag, got into my car and drove to the cabin. The forest roads were dark, the only light coming from my headlights cutting through the mist. The air felt heavy, like the whole world was holding its breath. When I finally arrived, I saw the faint glow of light coming from inside the cabin. My hands trembled as I stepped out of the car and made my way to the door. I could hear voices inside, Julia's and Derek's. They were arguing. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding, and reached for the doorknob. The door creaked open as I pushed it gently, not wanting to alert them to my presence. The inside of the cabin was dimly lit by a few scattered lamps, casting long shadows across the wooden walls. The scent of pine and old leather filled the air. Julia was standing by the window, her back to me. Derek was pacing near the fireplace, his eyes flicking back and forth between her and the door. He didn't see me yet, but I could tell he knew something was off. There was an unease in the way he moved, an edge to his voice that hadn't been there before. "I don't understand why you won't listen to me." Julia's voice was shaky, but it was also filled with frustration. "You're just so determined to ruin everything." "He's the one who's been here for me, Mum, not you." I felt a coldness settle over me. Julia's words stung. They were the same words Derek had planted in her mind. She was lost, and he had her right where he wanted her. "Julia, please. This isn't about you and Derek," I said softly, stepping into the room. Both of them froze. Julia turned slowly, her eyes wide with shock, and Derek's hand instinctively moved towards his coat pocket. It was a subtle movement, but I saw it. My heart skipped a beat, but I couldn't let myself be intimidated. "What are you doing here?" Julia demanded, her voice now sharp, defensive. "I'm here to bring you home," I said, my voice steady despite the tightness in my chest. "You're not thinking clearly. Derek is not who you think he is." Derek's smile was tight, his posture now radiating something far darker than I'd ever seen before. He didn't speak at first. Instead, he watched me with that cold, calculating look in his eyes. "You shouldn't have come, Helen," he said, his voice low. "It's not safe for you here." I took a step forward, not backing down. "I'm not afraid of you, Derek. I know what you're doing, and I won't let you manipulate my daughter anymore." Julia looked from me to Derek, her expression conflicted. "You're wrong," she said, her voice trembling. "You're always wrong about him. He loves me. Why can't you just accept that?" "I'm not wrong, Julia," I said, my voice shaking now with the fear I'd been hiding for weeks. "Derek has been using you." "I've seen it. I've seen the lies. He's not in this for love. He's in it for something far worse." Derek laughed, a low, menacing sound. "You really think I'm after your money, don't you?" he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "That's all you think I want." I looked him in the eye, not flinching. "I know what you're really after, Derek. It's not just money. It's control. You're trying to take everything I've built, and now you've dragged my daughter into it." Julia's face went pale. She turned to Derek, her expression one of disbelief. "Is that true? Is this about the money?" Derek's smile faltered for a moment, but it quickly returned. "You really think I'd do that to you, Julia? I'm here for you. Only you." I could see the doubt beginning to form in her eyes. Just the slightest flicker, but it was there. Derek knew it too. He was losing his grip, and it was terrifying him. "You think I'm lying?" Derek's voice grew harder, colder. "You're making a mistake. I've been nothing but good to you, Julia, and this is how you repay me?" "By listening to her." He pointed at me, his hand trembling with rage. "You're nothing but an obstacle in my way, Helen." My heart pounded in my chest as Derek moved closer, his anger palpable in the room. I stood my ground, my eyes never leaving his. You've made a huge mistake, Derek, but I'm going to make sure Julia sees the truth. Julia looked at me, her expression torn, and then back at Derek. The conflict in her eyes was heartbreaking. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe in the fairy tale he had promised her. But deep down, I could see the uncertainty creeping in. "You're both wrong," Julia whispered, barely audible. I can't just give up on him." "You're not giving up on him, Julia," I said gently. "You're saving yourself." And then, in the silence that followed, the door to the cabin slammed open. I whipped around, my heart leaping in my chest. A man stood in the doorway. He was tall, wearing a dark coat and a serious expression. His presence immediately filled the room. Derek's face drained of colour as he recognised him. "Detective Hale," Derek muttered under his breath. His confidence shattered, the walls crumbling around him. Julia turned to look at me in confusion. "What's going on, Mom? Who is this?" "Someone who's here to help," I said, my voice barely a whisper of relief. "Julia, you need to listen to him." Detective Hale stepped forward, his eyes locking onto Derek. "Derek Hunt, you are under arrest for fraud, money laundering, and several other charges. You have the right to remain silent." Everything seemed to stop. Derek's eyes widened in shock. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The charm, the confidence, the smile, it all vanished. The mask had finally slipped and he was exposed. "You," Derek began, his voice shaking with fury. "You can't do this." "Oh, I can," Hale said, stepping closer, his voice firm and unwavering. "You've been running from the law for far too long. Now it's over." For the first time, Julia's expression softened, a tear sliding down her cheek. You lied to me." Derek glared at me, but I didn't flinch. "I tried to warn you, Julia, but I couldn't protect you if you wouldn't listen. Now you'll see the truth." As Detective Hale cuffed Derek and led him outside, I finally exhaled a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. It was over. The man who had almost destroyed everything I loved was finally taken away. But it wasn't over for Julia. The damage had been done. She would need time. Time to heal, to understand. And that was the hardest part of all. I turned to her, my heart aching. "You'll be okay, sweetheart." "I'll help you through this." Julia didn't respond. She just stood there, tears streaming down her face, staring at the door Derek had just walked through. The days that followed Derek's arrest were a blur of confusion, grief, and a profound sense of loss. Julia wasn't the same anymore. She wasn't the bright-eyed, trusting girl I'd known. Her innocence had been stolen, not just by Derek's manipulation, but by her own willingness to believe in a lie. I tried to give her space. I knew she needed time to process everything, to come to terms with what had happened. But as the days turned into weeks, I found it harder to watch her retreat further into herself. She hardly spoke, and when she did, her voice lacked the vibrancy it once held. She'd become distant, withdrawn even. I'd find her staring out the window at the empty driveway, her thoughts miles away. She stopped coming downstairs for meals, and when she did, it was only to pick at her food before returning to her room. I could tell she blamed herself, and I hated seeing it. But what could I do? I could only watch and wait for her to find her way back to me. One evening, about 3 weeks after the arrest, Julia came into the sitting room where I was sitting by the fire. She had that same look in her eyes, the one that told me she was about to say something important. "Mom," she said softly, sitting across from me. "I've been thinking a lot. About everything." I nodded, waiting. I didn't want to push her. She needed to say it when she was ready. I never thought he was capable of something like this. I mean, I knew there were things I didn't understand, but I never imagined it would go this far. I swallowed hard, fighting back tears. He was a master at hiding the truth, sweetheart. But you weren't the only one fooled. I almost lost everything too. You're not alone in this. She stared at her hands, her fingers twisting in her lap. I feel like I should have known. Like I should have seen it. He was always so perfect, and now I feel so stupid. I reached out and took her hand in mine, giving it a gentle squeeze. Julia, you're not stupid. You were in love, and love makes people blind to the flaws they don't want to see. He knew that, and he used it against you. Her voice cracked. I should have listened to you sooner. I didn't want to believe it, Mom. I thought you were just being protective. But now I see. He wasn't the person I thought he was. He was nothing like what he pretended to be. My heart broke as I watched her struggle. The guilt she carried was unjust, but it was real and it was weighing her down. It's not your fault, I said softly. What he did to you was cruel. You couldn't have known. But what matters now is that you're safe. You're free. She nodded slowly. Her eyes reddened from tears she hadn't let fall until now. I don't know how to trust anyone anymore, especially myself. I feel like I've lost myself in all of this. I didn't know how to fix it. How could I? But I knew that the first step was to be there for her, no matter how long it took. You haven't lost yourself, Julia. You've just been through something horrible. It's going to take time, but you'll heal. And I'll be here every step of the way. You'll get through this. She leaned into me then, and for the first time in weeks I felt the weight on my chest lift slightly. She hadn't given up on me, on us. It was a small victory, but it was enough. A few days later, the full extent of Derek's crimes began to unfold. The police had uncovered more of his illegal dealings, and there were even rumours that he had connections to an underground criminal network. His manipulation of Julia was just the surface of what he'd been doing. He had been laundering money through various businesses, siphoning off funds from unsuspecting investors, and using Julia as a pawn in his game. It made me sick to think that, for all his charm, for all the promises he made, he had been nothing but a con artist, a man with no soul. His charm was just a mask, and under it he was a predator. The police had seized his assets, and it wasn't long before the media caught wind of the story. News outlets from across the country were suddenly interested in Derek Hunt, and his once perfect reputation began to crumble. But none of it mattered to me. Not anymore. Julia was still trying to process it all, but she was beginning to show signs of her old self again. She started taking walks in the garden, sitting outside with a book, letting the fresh air fill her lungs. She still wasn't talking much, but I could see the faintest hint of hope in her eyes. It wasn't the same as before, but it was a start. I knew that Derek's arrest had been a turning point, but the real healing would come from Julia's ability to forgive herself and to trust again. A few weeks after Derek's arrest, I received an unexpected visitor. Detective Hale, the man who had helped bring Derek down, came by the house. He was tall, serious, and always impeccably dressed, but today he looked different. His eyes were softer, less guarded than usual. "Helen," he said after a moment of small talk. "I wanted to check in. How's Julia doing?" I sighed, leaning back in my chair. "She's getting there. It's slow, but she's trying." Hale nodded. "I'm glad to hear that. You know, I've worked a lot of cases, but this one hit different. The whole situation with Derek, the manipulation, the lies, it was hard to watch. I've seen people like him before, but I've never seen anyone like Julia." I looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean that she was strong," he said quietly. "She had every reason to fall apart, to give up, but she didn't. She fought for herself, for you, even when she didn't know how." I felt a lump form in my throat. She's stronger than I ever gave her credit for. "It's just going to take time." Detective Hale stood up to leave. "If you ever need anything at all, don't hesitate to reach out." I nodded. "Thank you, Detective. I appreciate it." As he left, I stood at the door, watching him walk down the driveway. Something had shifted. Derek was gone, and though the scars of his presence would remain for a while, I knew that eventually we'd move past this. Julia would heal. She would reclaim her life, her trust, her happiness, and I would be here right beside her, for as long as she needed me. The days grew longer as the seasons shifted, and with each passing week, I saw more of my daughter returning to herself. It wasn't easy. Healing never is, but there were signs. Small ones, sometimes barely noticeable, but they were there. The way she'd laugh softly at a joke, the way her eyes would light up when she spoke about the future, even the way she started leaving her bedroom door open, inviting the rest of the world in again. But I knew the scars were deep, and recovery wasn't linear. Some days she'd retreat, the weight of everything that had happened settling on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. Other days she'd seem almost like her old self, filled with life and energy. I would give her space when she needed it, but I would also be there when she came to me, which she did more often than not. One afternoon, Julia came down for tea. It had become a small ritual of ours. We'd sit together in the sitting room by the fire, talk about life, and just be. I'd learned not to rush things, not to push her into conversations she wasn't ready for. So I let her take the lead. "I've been thinking a lot," Julia said as she settled into the armchair beside me. "About the future, I mean." "About what exactly?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light, casual. She took a sip of her tea before answering. "I've decided to go back to school. I want to finish my degree. I want to focus on something that's mine. Not for anyone else, just for me." I felt a lump in my throat. "That's a big step, sweetheart. But I'm so proud of you. You don't need anyone's approval for this. Just yourself." Julia smiled faintly, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of her cup. "I've realised I've been living for other people, for Derek, for you, for everything else. But now I think I need to do something for me. Something that makes me feel whole again." It was a moment of pure clarity. The hurt was still there, but in that moment Julia had found a sliver of hope, a new beginning. She was reclaiming her life, one small step at a time. Over the next few months, Julia threw herself into her studies. She took up art history, something that had always fascinated her, but she'd never made time for. It was a way for her to connect with herself again, a way to rediscover her passion and purpose without being defined by what had happened. And as she found herself again, I found myself too. I realised that I had spent so much time focused on protecting her, on keeping her safe from the world, that I had forgotten to take care of myself. I started revisiting old hobbies, things I had neglected for years. I took up painting again, something I had once loved, and began volunteering at a local charity that helped young women regain their confidence after traumatic experiences. I realised that in helping others, I could help myself heal too. It wasn't long before Julia started inviting friends over again. The house, once filled with an eerie silence, was now alive with the chatter of her friends, the laughter of young women reclaiming their own identities. It was a sound I hadn't realised I'd missed until I heard it again, but despite the progress, there were still moments when I could see the shadows of the past creeping back into Julia's eyes. A phone call, a late-night thought, a flash of doubt in her voice. It was those moments that reminded me that healing wasn't an event, it was a journey. And it would take time. But she was on her way, and I had to trust that she would find her own strength, just like I had to find mine. A few months later, the trial for Derek's crimes began. The media circus was in full swing, but I refused to let it get to me. It wasn't about Derek anymore. It was about Julia, and it always had been. The courtroom was filled with tension, the air thick with anticipation. Derek sat across from us, his once polished appearance now tarnished. He was no longer the confident man who had walked into our lives with promises of love and luxury. He was a man broken, a man whose lies had finally caught up to him. But as I watched him, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of pity. His entire life had been built on deception, and now that house of cards was crumbling. The trial lasted for weeks. Witnesses testified about Derek's illegal dealings, his manipulation of investors, and the web of lies he had spun around Julia. It was as if he had thought he could escape the consequences of his actions forever. But justice was being served, and I felt a strange sense of satisfaction as each piece of evidence piled up against him. Finally, the day came when Derek was sentenced. The judge was clear. He would spend the next 25 years behind bars. It was over. Derek's influence on our lives was done. The weight that had been holding me down, holding Julia down, was finally lifted. But I couldn't celebrate. Not really. The damage had been done. Julia had suffered, and that would never go away. But as she walked out of the courtroom beside me, her head held high, I knew we were free. Weeks passed, and life began to settle into a new rhythm. The scars remained, but the sharpness of the pain was dulled by time, by the small victories we'd earned together. I saw my daughter growing stronger every day. She was no longer the girl who had been blinded by love, the one who had trusted the wrong person with her heart. She was becoming the woman she was meant to be, resilient, smart and independent. One afternoon, as I watched her in the garden, sketching something in her notebook, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She had come so far, and so had I. "You're doing good, you know," I said to her, my voice soft. She looked up at me, a small, knowing smile on her lips. I think I'm finally starting to believe that. We sat there for a long time, the sun setting behind us, casting long shadows over the garden. For the first time in what felt like forever, the air felt light, like we could breathe again. And in that moment, I knew that no matter what had happened, we had survived. We had made it through, together. Months had passed since Derek was sentenced. The media had long since lost interest, and life had begun to feel almost normal again. Almost Julia was different now. The girl who had once been lost in the maze of Derek's lies was slowly emerging from the shadows. I saw her confidence returning, her spark coming back, but it was a quiet transformation. One day, she would tell me she had applied to an art gallery internship. The next, she would talk about plans for a trip to Europe with some friends from school. Small steps, but they were signs that she was finding herself again. I never pushed. I never asked for more than she was ready to give. I knew better now. Derek had stolen so much from her, but she was taking back what was hers, one piece at a time. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset, Julia joined me with a cup of tea in her hands. She was quieter than usual, and I could tell something was weighing on her. "Mum," she said after a few moments of silence, her voice steady but laced with uncertainty. "I've been thinking about Derek again. I know we've both been trying to move on, but I keep thinking about how I let him control so much of my life." I nodded slowly. "It's okay to think about it, sweetheart. It's part of the process. But don't let it take over again. You've come so far." "I know," she said, looking out at the horizon, "but I still feel like I let him win sometimes. Like I'm not strong enough to completely let go." "You're stronger than you think," I replied softly. "You don't have to let go of everything at once. Healing takes time. It's not about forgetting what happened. It's about learning to live with it and still move forward. You've already done that. She was quiet for a long while and I didn't press her. Julia had always been one to think deeply before speaking. Finally, she spoke again. "I think I'm ready to start forgiving myself," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Not for him, but for me. For allowing him to take so much of me. For not seeing what he really was sooner. But I don't want to carry that guilt anymore. I want to be free of it. My heart swelled with pride. And you will be, Julia. You already are. The weeks that followed were filled with small victories. Julia had secured the internship she'd applied for at a local art gallery, and it was a huge step for her. I saw the joy in her eyes when she came home after her first day. She was alive again, not just surviving, but thriving. She started talking more about her future, about the things she wanted to achieve, the places she wanted to visit, the career she wanted to build. I watched her grow in ways I had never imagined. I no longer saw the fragile, broken girl who had fallen for Derek's manipulations. I saw a woman who had learned the hard way what it meant to stand tall, to reclaim her life. And as for me, I found myself moving forward as well. I'd focused so much on Julia's healing that I hadn't paid attention to my own. But as she began to heal, so did I. I started reaching out more, reconnecting with old friends, attending events, and even dating a little. It wasn't about finding someone else to fill the void. It was about rediscovering myself, about feeling whole again. One day, as we sat together in the living room, Julia brought up something I had been dreading but knew was coming. "Mum," she said, her voice tentative, Do you think I'll ever really trust anyone again? After everything that happened with Derek?" I sat beside her, taking a deep breath. "I think you'll trust again, sweetheart. It's not about forgetting what happened. It's about knowing that you can protect yourself now. And you will. Trust doesn't come all at once, and it doesn't mean you'll never get hurt again. But it does mean you'll be able to recognize who's worth trusting." She nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "I guess I have to start trusting myself first, huh?" "Exactly," I said, smiling softly. "Trust yourself, and the rest will follow." Life, however, has a way of surprising you. A few weeks after that conversation, I received a call that would change everything once again. It was from Detective Hale. He didn't call often, and when he did, it was usually about a case. I never expected the next words he would say. "Mrs. Stevens," he began, "I have some information that might interest you. It's about Derek." I felt a tight knot form in my stomach. "What about him?" "Well, there's something you need to know," Hale continued, his voice serious. "While Derek was incarcerated, we discovered a series of additional accounts tied to other criminal activities, much deeper than we originally thought. It's possible there were people involved who haven't been caught yet. And it seems someone may have been working with Derek. We're still investigating, but I wanted you to be aware. There's a chance that there's still danger lurking out there." My heart dropped. "Are you telling me he's not the only one?" "That's what we're trying to figure out," Hale said. "We're just letting you know in case anything happens." I hung up the phone, my mind racing. Derek wasn't the only threat. There were more people, more secrets, and even though he was behind bars, the shadows of his actions still haunted us. The next few weeks were filled with uncertainty. Julia and I took extra precautions, and Detective Hale kept us updated on the investigation. But I refused to let fear control us. We had come too far to let it all unravel now. And then, one afternoon, after nearly a month of tension, the police informed us that the investigation had uncovered the rest of the criminal ring. Derek had been working with a group that had been laundering money across several countries, using various fronts. But the authorities had managed to take down the whole operation. Derek's involvement in the larger network was clearer than ever, and his arrest had led to the downfall of several dangerous individuals. It was over. Derek's influence was finished. As the final pieces fell into place, Julia and I sat in the garden, watching the sunset. It felt like a lifetime ago that we had been trapped in that nightmare. But here we were, free, do you feel it? Julia asked, her voice soft. Feel what? I replied, turning to her. Like we're really free, she said, a faint smile playing at her lips. Like everything that's happened is behind us. I looked at her, seeing the strength in her that I hadn't seen before. She wasn't the girl who had been manipulated and deceived. She was a woman, stronger and wiser than I could have ever imagined. I feel it, I said, squeezing her hand. We're free. The days that followed Derek's complete fall from grace felt like a quiet victory. The weight we'd carried for so long, the fear, the uncertainty, it had all melted away, leaving space for something new. Peace. Not perfect peace, but something that felt like it could last. Julia continued to flourish, her confidence growing with each passing day. She finished her internship at the art gallery and was offered a full-time position. The decision to pursue art history was one she'd never regretted. It had become her passion, her voice, and she was finally letting it lead her. It wasn't just her career that was coming together, it was her whole life. I saw her reconnect with friends she had lost touch with, those friendships that had faded in the wake of Derek's manipulation. She was starting to build a life outside of the shadows of the past, and that made me prouder than I could express. She had been through so much, and now she was creating her own path, one that was free from the lies, the deceit, and the control that Derek had once held over her. It was a new chapter, a new beginning. As for me, I had found a sense of peace I hadn't expected. I spent more time focusing on the things that truly mattered, my family, my friends, and the relationships that had been affected by everything that had happened. I continued volunteering and began travelling more, something I had always wanted to do but never had the time for. I visited places I had always dreamed of and met people who shared my experiences, my values, and my hopes. It was liberating. The house felt alive again, filled with laughter, conversation, and warmth. I'd often catch myself looking at Julia, watching her laugh with her friends, seeing her thrive, and I knew that the nightmare we had lived through was over. She was okay. We were okay. One afternoon, as I was putting a pot of tea on the stove, I felt Julia's presence in the doorway. I turned, and there she was, standing in the frame with that smile I had missed for so long. It was the same smile I had seen years ago, before Derek ever entered our lives, full of promise and hope. "Mom," she said, her voice full of that quiet confidence she'd finally found again. "I've been thinking a lot lately. About everything. About how far we've come." I smiled, motioning for her to sit at the table. "I know. We've both come a long way." She sat down across from me, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup as she spoke. "I think about Derek sometimes, but not the way I used to, not with anger or fear. I think about how he taught me so much about myself, about what I want, about who I am, and I realized that I had to go through that to get here, to be who I am now." I felt a lump form in my throat. "That's a hard thing to say, sweetheart. But I'm proud of you. I've watched you grow, and I've seen you rebuild yourself. You're stronger than you think." She paused, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my heart swell. "I know it wasn't just me who got here. It was you too. You never gave up on me, even when I couldn't see it myself, even when I thought you were wrong." I reached across the table and took her hand, squeezing it tightly. "I'll never give up on you, Julia. I never will. I'm so proud of you. You've taught me more than you'll ever know." We sat in silence for a while, each of us lost in our own thoughts, but united in the understanding that the worst was behind us. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was ours, and that was enough. As time went on, Derek's name faded from our lives like a distant memory. The legal battles had ended, the police investigations had concluded, and all that was left was the healing. But I knew that the scars would always remain on both of us. Yet, instead of being reminders of pain, those scars became symbols of strength. They told the story of our survival, of how we had risen from the ashes of betrayal and manipulation. One day, as I was cleaning out the attic, I found a box of old photographs. Some of them were from the days before Derek, before any of the chaos. There were pictures of me and Julia when she was just a child, when life was simpler, when there was laughter and innocence in her eyes. I smiled as I flipped through the pages, remembering those moments, and then I found one. It was a photo of me and Thomas, taken just a few months before he passed away. We were standing together in the garden, laughing with Julia in the background. It was a moment frozen in time. A moment before life got complicated. For a brief moment, I felt the weight of the past, the grief of losing him, the pain of the years that had followed. But then I looked at Julia, who had entered the room behind me, and I realized something. I wasn't alone anymore. I never had been. She walked over to me, looking at the photo. "I miss him too," she said softly, her hand resting on my shoulder. "I know," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "But he would have been so proud of you, of both of us," she smiled gently, her eyes soft. "We made it, Mum. We're okay." And in that moment, I realized that it wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living. It was about learning to embrace the future, no matter how uncertain, and finding peace with the past. We had both learned how to heal, how to trust again, and how to love ourselves, despite everything that had happened, and that was all that mattered.